Alright, good afternoon everybody. We've reached the last panel, so it's been a very smooth and successful conference so far. We've got 3 speakers to finish with, so with a little bit more flexibility with time, I've asked everyone to try to stick to 15, maybe slightly above the 15 minutes, and then we should have time for discussion at the end, and finish in about 1 hour and 5 minutes, I hope. And then we'll have a little closing remarks from the organisers. So don't run out the door while you're clapping for the last panel. So the first speaker we have is Burcu, who is going to speak about European national identities versus European identities.
Yeah. So, I put it this way, European national identities versus European identity, to be as a catch-up phrase, but actually I will try to answer the question that can European identity be an alternative to national identity? Actually, these are not mutually exclusive concepts, because identity is a multidimensional concept, but sometimes they can be competitive when it comes to foreign policy behavior. And generally, I will try to answer this question theoretically. And here's the outline of mine. So I will try to briefly define the concept of identity, then concentrate on the collective and individual identities and civic and ethnic type of national identities. And then I will ask the question of whether is there a European identity prior to the efforts of the Union, and then the rest of the paper will develop at 2 levels. At level 1, which is the institutional level, I will talk about EU's identity building efforts. And then the individual level, I will make use of some research, mainly Eurobarometer surveys, to evaluate people's identification with European identity and in relation to national identity. So, you know, identity is a social phenomenon, and a person identifies others and is identified by them. So this leads to the self-identification as a result of the socialization processes. So, the individual identity is one's self-definition and self-identification with a group, and collective identity can be defined as the self-image of a group based on common values and symbols and shared memories. So, it's specifically important to define national identity for the purposes of this presentation. There are mainly 2 types of national identities, generally basically divided into 2 as civic or territorial-based national identity, and ethnic or essentialist-based national identity. Civic national identity based on the equality of citizens, centrality of the national homeland and territory and civic culture. And if we define the identity on essentialist grounds, with a holistic approach based on ethnic descent and cultural rights, that we have the ethnic type of national identity. So this distinction is important for the purposes of the paper, because we can observe a move in the European identity, national identity building process, a move from essential understanding to a civil understanding, which we'll see it later. So, whether there is a European identity prior to the efforts of the Union, for Delaunay to such a question, he says that there existed a collective European identity in some form from the 16th century onwards, but one cannot not talk about a European identity as part of personal identities until the late 19th century. So when we think of the historical legacies of European identity, we can think of the ancient Greek culture, and we can think of the Roman Empire with its universal army with common standards and legal system, law and administration providing unity to its domain. And with the adoption of Christianity by the Roman Empire, Europe came to be seen more than just a geographical region. And with the Islam's birth and expansion in Europe, the continent became Christianized, and the European identity and Christian identity began to mean the same thing, specifically with the Crusades. So it began to change with the Renaissance, Reformation and Enlightenment. And with the colonialization, we can see that Europeans distinguished themselves from the rest of the world as of being civilized, as all we know, white man's burden. So the criteria of being civilized defined by them as based on their own experiences like secularism, humanism, democracy, industrialism, enlightenment, scientific revolutions, and rationalism. So these are all important because they are mostly referenced by the EU elite in the identity building processes. So the policies aimed to inculcate European consciousness was by repetition, as Michael Billig calls it, banal nationalism. There is a continual flagging and reminding of nationhood. In our daily lives, we routinely accept the things that are constructed as natural. So that's why it's relatively easy to identify oneself with a nation state. It has frontiers, it has national anthems, flags, postage stamps, taxes, passports, etc. So what the EU Commission does is applying these elements at the supranational level, benefiting from these ways to inculcate European awareness. So a committee was formed after the low turnout in the 1984 parliament elections, and a report is written by the MEP Odonino, the chairman of the EDO Committee for a People's Europe, and about the need to provoke European awareness based on common legacy and cultural heritages in the history of Europe that include the Christian religion, Greek Hellenistic ideas of government, philosophy and art, Roman law, Renaissance humanism, the ideals of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, social democracy and the rule of law. So, there are many policies to forge such an identity. One of them can be the Union's deliberate choice of the names of the major educational programs like Erasmus, Socrates and Leonardo. We can also observe it under the rationale of the logo of the European Council, which is, of course, the flag of the EU, which symbolizes 12 as a symbol of perfection and plenitude, etc., etc., as you can read there. And I think another important policy of the European Commission to inculcate European awareness was Commission-financed European studies programs, which myself is graduated from one of them. And as we all know, national states provide mass education to raise a nation and to create the nationals. So we can see that this can be borrowed from the nation building techniques at the EU level. So, like European anthem, Beethoven's Ode to Joy, postage stamps bearing portraits of the EC pioneers such as Robert Schuman and Jean Monnet, or the EU passports can be said one of them. So one can argue that there is a certain amount of truth in EU's emphasis on the shared cultural heritage claims like Greek and Roman civilizations, Renaissance, Reformation, Enlightenment, so on and so forth. However, it has to be stated that not all the Europeans share all of them. As Smith puts it, Europeans differ among themselves as much as from the non-Europeans in respect of language, territory, law, religion, and economic and political systems, as well as ethnicity and culture. So, we can talk about, according to Smith, we can talk about the European family of cultures, but we cannot talk about a unity in diversity. Because Europe lacks a pre-modern past, a prehistory that can provide it with emotional sustenance and historical depth. This is from an ethnosymbolic perspective, so we can say that from an essentialist or ethnosymbolic perspective, European identity cannot be an alternative to national identity. As Nikolaidis puts it, with their calls for a common flag, passport, anthem, supranationalists are trying to recreate a national mystique on the European level. So, but we can see a move from an essential understanding to a civic understanding, specifically after the post-Maastricht Treaty discussions. There was the issue of Maastricht justification of German Constitutional Court in October 1993. So it's argued that it's incompatible with the Germany's constitution, but later at the end court decided that the Maastricht Treaty was in conformity with democratic principles because instead of a European state it only established the union of states. But still it can be argued that at the EU level the identity building techniques was benefited to indulge European awareness. So we can talk about the introduction of euro. Actually, it's for monetary and economic reasons, but it has some kind of meaning in that terms too. Because money is political, and a key expression of statehood and nationhood. States express their sovereignty in issuing and managing their own currencies. So, but we have to state that there is not a specific person or a building in anywhere in Europe on the euros, there are some abstract architectural images, so we can see that the civic understanding of European identity. And the discussions reheated with the constitutional treaty. As we all know, the constitutions constitute the legal basis of the states, and the international treaties form the basis of the supranational institutions. But you know, the EU is kind of a mixed thing, so things became complicated when it comes to constitution. And a draft constitution was written by the Convention on the Future of Europe, giving more supranationality to the Union, but it was non-ratified. But it was declared only in 2 countries, France and Netherlands, and all of the others accepted it, so this is something. So we can talk that theoretically European identity cannot be an alternative to national identity. When it comes to the individual level, I'll try to briefly analyze the existing research data on public opinion. Before moving to that, as I said before, the non-ratification of the constitution in French and Dutch referendums is significant in terms of public view, because there is a reaction to the supranationality of the constitution. And there is another research by Burcu on what citizens mean by feeling European perceptions of new symbols and borderlessness. He has chosen a sample from France, UK and Netherlands. Despite the non-representative character of the sample, it provides an understanding of what citizens means when they refer to their political and European identity. He concludes that a civic understanding of European identity, rather than cultural, defined by the Europeans as being European. So by experiencing Europe, by traveling, living where both people feel more European. Then I want to move to Eurobarometer surveys. This is a survey on people's identification with their own countries and Europe as a whole in percentages between 1992 to 2005. So the percentage amount of the people who choose European only, as we can see, is the lowest one. And the percentage of the group who identify first with Europe, then nationality, is also relatively low. But the people who put nationality first and then European generally exceeded the percentage of the people who only identify themselves with nationality. So we can say that people kind of feel attached to the EU, although not as much as their nationality. So when it comes to the other table, New Europeans, the most important elements are the euro, as we can see. Yeah, this is the one. We see they're attached to the democratic values and geography. I don't know if you can read the question. It's which of the following are the 2 most important elements that go to make up a European identity? The first one is euro. I just talked about the social effects of euro, other than monetary and economic effects. And democratic values, geography, common culture, common history, a high level of social protection. And you see the common religious heritage is just 5%. So this is another survey. We can see at this table, people identify nationality only is 42%, and nationality and European 47%. And here, the latest one, I mean, the percentages are quite small, but we can say that in total, here, total European feelings are 54, and here, 59. So, we can say that European identity cannot be an alternative to national identity, but we can see people can be attached to both, but when it comes to the national interests of their nationality, things are different. So, thank you so much. Thank you for
What we have now is Tamara, who's going to talk about nationalism and social class, bringing class back in, the understanding of nationalist worldviews in Southeast Europe.
Thanks.
Okay, so I am a little bit of an imposter here because I actually finished my PhD 2 years ago. But since I haven't had time to really move beyond, I've been out of academia for a while, I thought it would be a great chance to kind of go back to where I was when I was finishing the PhD and what I actually want to do with it, since I haven't even had time to think about it since I wrote it. So the idea is, and this is one of kind of the accidental findings from the dissertation, was how much class matters to nation. So I'm going to talk today about the relationship between class and nation and how we can actually bring class back into nation. So as I said, I found the influence of class to be one of the main findings for my dissertation, which actually was supposed to examine, as we were speaking with Sinisha earlier, on everyday identity. So I went into schools and I talked to children and I wanted to see when do they draw upon nationalist notions. So not asking them what does it mean to be Serbian, but when do they start kind of thinking of categories of being Serbian and Croatian. And I purposely had split the sample to include some upper class kids and some, I split the sample to have some of the working class or who will be the working class. But this was actually the biggest finding that I found, was that the youth in Serbia and Croatia who were from this working class background were actually much more similar in terms of worldviews with each other than they were with their kind of more upper class peers in their own state. And this relationship, of course, is not surprising. We have the link between socioeconomic status and illiberal attitudes is established. It's generally the trope: the more educated you are, the more liberal you are, or the less ethnically exclusive, less homophobic, or whatever. As we all know, though, this doesn't always hold, so I'm going to try to unpack this a little bit. And especially in the post-Yugoslav context, class, of course, during socialism, it was all about class. And then this was dropped when we moved to, during the wars, it was all about the ethnic group you belong to. And now, 20 years after the war, it's clear that we have class cleavages, but nobody's studying them because your primary affiliation is a member of your nation or of your ethnic group. So I'm not going to spend too much time about this, but a lot of scholars have said, let's stop being so obsessed with ethnic identity, let's move to the cleavages that actually work below it. The importance of class still remains relevant. The problem here is that class in the Southeast European context is very heavily loaded as a communist, socialist kind of concept. So we might think about moving into discussion of using Burcu or something less rigid as class. Because when you say class to somebody from Southeastern Europe, they don't think of class the same way we as sociologists do in terms of socioeconomic status. And populism, even now, the spread of populism is starting to be understood in these terms of disenfranchisement, precariousness, how you're dealing with all of the transitions, especially for the generations who are now maybe 15 or 16, are the losers of the transition from nationalism to democracy. So in Yugoslavia, some research has already been done. We know there's an urban-rural divide. We know that there's a relationship between occupation and education, and nationalistic variables. Usually the dependent variables people have used have been things like how attached are you to Europe, very much what you look at. So who's more likely to say my primary affiliation is European and my secondary is nationality? So here we see education matters, income matters, and so on. And NGOs have also looked at this to see who are the biggest supporters of nationalism. So the NGO studies have concluded that we have this kind of liberal democratic bloc. They're mostly liberal, support gay rights, support Europe. It's kind of this and then you have the uneducated masses who are against the European Union, who are homophobic and so on, anti-Western. Obviously this line is not linear. So the argument that I'm trying to make is first that we can't say that the masses, it's dangerous to say the masses are simply stupid. So first of all, is there a linear relationship? That people who are uneducated tend to be more nationalistic? And if it is linear, what are the mechanisms? So it's not enough to just say you're uneducated and you're nationalistic. What is making uneducated people nationalistic first? And second, if it's not linear, what are the mediating factors? So for example, maybe more education makes you less nationalistic, but if you're religious, this is actually mitigated. So which other factors come in? And then finally, so even if we say it's not linear, these mitigating factors are coming in, the very important thing that I am now looking at is what is a dependent variable? How are we measuring nationalism? So is it, how do you feel about Srebrenica? How do you feel about war heroes? These kind of very heavy symbols? Or is it just kind of what do you feel about the flag? Or how do you celebrate national rituals? So is it even okay to measure nationalist worldviews? How can we even measure the degree of nationalism? So very quickly in the dissertation, what I did is I had vocational high school. So in Belgrade, this were people who would be butchers and bakers. In Croatia, the vocational high school was people who would be working in the railways. So very kind of future working class. And one of the best 3 high schools in Belgrade and in Korea and in Zagreb, who are preparing kind of you would say the intellectuals or the elite. And I also added 8th grade to see if there was an age, and I tried to have about 25 in each. So I had 160 in-depth interviews, and then I also did 1,200 surveys all over Serbia. And learn from me and publish your results as soon as you're done with them, because now all of my dissertation fieldwork is old. I mean, when I did this in 2010, Croatia wasn't in the EU. We had a democratic president in Serbia, for example. I mean, these results are really not applicable anymore, and publish as soon as you're done. So in the dissertation, I found, of course, similarities and differences. I definitely found the crazy thing was you go to the elite high school. Who are your 3 favorite Serbs? They tell you. You go into the working class high school. Who are your 3 least favorite Serbs? And you get this. I mean, it was crazy how much. What are you proud of in one school was what are you least proud of in the other. And that's the same thing I found with Croatia. I mean, these very, very stark differences. And of course, across the board, boys were more ethnocentric than girls. But there were a lot of other things in common. Youth in both countries were fatigued with history. They shared disillusionment generally in politics, government, and so on, and were much more preoccupied with everyday concerns. How are they going to get jobs, and so on. And I'll skip the other ones, I can get back to them. So now, with influence of class, I looked at things like education, rural, urban, region, gender. Of course, it's hard because it was in-depth interviews. And I looked at things like how they felt about LGBT parades, football hooliganism during the EU. I looked at whether their narratives were black and white. So how do you feel about Srebrenica? Is it a one-liner? Or can you tell that they actually have put thought into their explanation? And just in terms of who are your favorite figures, what's the best period of Serbian or Croatian history? Have you ever watched the news and felt ashamed of your country or proud of your country? So those kinds of, there were all sorts of different variables we could use to measure them. And then really quickly to show you what's really astounding whenever you look at these kinds of surveys in the former Yugoslavia with class, when you look at, so this is elite high school, a 4-year, so a better vocational school and a bad vocational school. All of these scores, I mean, they linearly grow or decrease based on the level of education. So elite high schools are liberal in terms of gender roles, how we can divide jobs, homosexuality, censorship. I mean, all of these things that we can pack as a liberal attitudes. You really see the numbers. I mean, it's as if you drew them on your own. Each level of education is more liberal. So now what I'm trying to do is combine all of the different big data sets that have been done to try to actually unpack these variables. The great thing is that now in 2011 there was a big survey that asked the same questions in Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, even Albania. So they did all of the former Yugoslav plus Albania minus Slovenia. And we have the same questions, and it's a huge representative data set. The problem that's going to come up is, first, how are we going to measure class? So what are the dependent variables? So is it education, income, occupation? So how are we going to capture them? And then also the cleavages within ethnic identity. So I'm trying to look at things, how do these variables interact? I also want to see what do we mean by nationalism. So I did some preliminary analysis using these. So on the right-hand side, I have the dependent ones. Kosovo, whether Mladic is a hero, should we cooperate with the war crime tribunals, Srebrenica, EU integration, religiousness, and then I put in all of these. And now I'm trying to see how they mesh. So the first thing to do was let me go back here, to do a principal component analysis of all of those right-hand ones. So can you even say that when you put Mladic and Srebrenica and Uljasic and EU in one, do you still have the same pattern? Or are there different types of nationalisms depending on how you decide to operationalize it? So as I said, there's a long list of questions you can use, and of course what you find is that this relationship doesn't hold for all of them. So for example, education could mitigate your opinion about Srebrenica, which it does, but maybe not for the European Union. So we have different new kinds of nationalisms where you have intellectuals and highly educated people who are against the EU or have different opinions of borders. And my job, and I don't have the results, I'm sorry to disappoint you yet, is to try to unpack what's going on. So in which of these cases does education make you more liberal or more progressive? And in which cases does it not? What offsets it? So, and one of the things that Siniša actually said that I should try to do is instead of asking, so when you say to a Serb or to Croat, something like Mladic or Srebrenica, these like huge explosive things, people are automatically polarized, and they're either very nationalistic or they're very anti-nationalistic. So instead of using those that most scholars use as these markers of nationalism, is to maybe use softer, kind of asking them more, more soft things about nationalism to get at how nationalist are they without jumping to these easy kind of not very nationalistic symbols. So very quickly for Serbia, I did some of this. Of course, the gender, is not surprising. You could very quickly summarize it. Men are always more. For all of these, the relationship between gender and nationalism stays constant. Men are, for all of them, more nationalist or more ethnocentric than women. With age, so the stars are the things that were significant. You do see some patterns with age. The more important one was education. So with Srebrenica, the genocide, if you had university education, you were much more likely to say that genocide happened there, and so on. But there's a lot of stuff going on here, and the big question is how to go about unpacking this to make a coherent argument about how class is informing this. So my job, or what I'm going to be doing over the summer, is actually interviewing these people. So now I need to go and try to find out what's going on. And we definitely know that there's an influence of education. We know that there are regional effects. We know the relationship is not linear. But now I want to go and try to see what is actually going on. So if you have any suggestions in terms of how to design the sample, or even what kinds of questions to be asking on the ground to try to get to these, that would be most useful to me. So in terms of discussion, the first one is, of course, what are we really measuring? The dependent variable, are we measuring class? Really, because all of these studies mostly end up taking class as your level of education or the level of education of your parents. That doesn't really capture class, because you could be very highly educated but work as a taxi driver. So it's kind of but the occupation also doesn't really tell you enough. So it's like how to really get to this understanding of class. Should I move beyond education and just go to Burcu, or in what way can I actually operationalize class? The second one is a dependent variable really about nationalism, or is it about prejudice identity? And as I said, harder versus softer nationalisms. And then the mythological questions of how important it is to talk to people, but when you talk to people, you can't really make generalizable conclusions on how these processes are working. So that's where I am right now. Thanks.
Thank you. Judith, talking about the missing ink. Whatever that is.
Hello everyone. Thank you for staying for the last speaker. The missing ink of the title is the title of my PhD. Like you, I've recently nearly finished. I had a Viva 2 weeks ago, so I'm very near. So the missing ink is what I believe is missing from Gellner's theory. I would maintain that he provides the why of nationalism. So the missing ink is an attempt to fill in the how. How do we learn our national identity? How do we think nationally? So this is not the when or the why, but the how. So in an attempt to do this, I've constructed what I call the socialization of nationalism. And Burcu seems to be very popular today. You'll be glad to know, I'm sure. How do I
Slideshow.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Okay, so I created the socialization triangle. This is, somebody else had a triangle earlier today. This is, so Bourdieu would maintain that family, social networks and education are what are needed for a successful socialization. So I say that if you have those three, then within that the socialization takes place. Now to explain, to use his framework for nationalism, what I did was, there are actually two parts to my thesis. One is an analysis of Irish history textbooks. So I do a comparison of the foundation of the national school system in Ireland in 1831 to 1922. So that's of course under British rule. Then I have the second period is 1922 to 1971, which 1971 is the onset of what was called it's still called the new curriculum, and it signifies Ireland joining the EU and a change in economic policy and the education. And then the third period, 1971 onwards. And within that, I do a comparison of three different events for the sake of easiness of explaining. So for the famine, the three different depictions of the famine. The second part of my thesis goes by the catchy title of The Observable Manifestation of National Habitus, and I utilise Bourdieu's framework here. So if we have here with Bourdieu, so we have his doxa, which Joe, you explained thoroughly, I won't reiterate it. So underneath that we have Bourdieu's analysis of habitus. So when he writes about it, he talks about food, names, sport, musical tastes, hobbies, education. Sorry, I don't know what that is. Fashion. And then we have hexis, which is a part of that. So the hexis is how something is actually embodied in the way you move. So he talks about eating, customs, and gait. So he talks about, say, the peasants being unable to dance fluidly. So I've utilised that framework and I've made it into a national doxa. So we have national doxa, national habitus, and I talk about, in my thesis, I talk about food, names, flags, heroes, money, passports, time and space. And then under national hexis, I talk about eating, customs, tipping. I also mention a few other things like personal space, queuing, spitting. These are all ways that our national habitus represents itself. So in the when I was analysing, the first bit I talk about is the textbooks. When I'm analysing textbooks, what's very interesting is the utilisation of world maps to configure the student's worldview. So this actually wasn't in any of the textbooks, but I've put that in to say, there is no such, any map is arbitrary. From space there is no up. So this, you know, if you're looking at the world, we could have it this way, as opposed to the way that we're used to having it. This is the Peter's projection map. This is, some geographers think that this is more accurate. Then we have a Russian world map, which of course is Russian-centric. Russia is at the middle, which of course makes perfect sense. Why would you have it anywhere else if you're going to be talking about it? But this is the one that I've used, was actually taken from a textbook from 1892. So what was very interesting from this period was, of course, when I first started reading this book, I was looking through dependencies for Ireland, and because this was the book used in Irish textbooks in schools. What was interesting was the British, the language was about involving Ireland in part of a United Kingdom. So there's the United Kingdom of England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales. And then they talk about other countries, Africa, Asia, China. So there's a difference there. But what is interesting about this map, if you can see, there's my pointer, in case you're unaware, there's England and Ireland right in the middle. So the quote that goes with that map, where's my gone? sorry.
If you use the arrows, you can go forward and backwards.
Oh, no. So this is the quote from the textbook. Now give one last look at the particular red spots which represent Great Britain and Ireland. They occupy nearly the centre of the land masses of the globe. This fact alone is of great importance and has largely helped to give England its present commercial supremacy. So of course it's completely illogical. They're saying that the reason that they have this empire was because they're in the middle of the globe. So later textbooks. So this is an example of the kind of dialogue that you get prior to 1922. From 1922 to 1971, the language is the history book is not a history of the world or a history of Ireland. It's basically, you could read it as a history of what the British did to the Irish. So for example, there's a chapter devoted solely to Oliver Cromwell. And the opening lines of the chapter say, as an Irishman, I can barely bear to read or write this man's name for what he did to my pure and gentle people. So that's the kind of dialogue that we have until 1971. 1971, there was an OECD report for Ireland joining the EU, which the recommendations were that it would change its education to underpin a change in economic development, because Ireland was failing at the time economically. The language then changes to become more inclusive. So when they discuss the famine, it's more inclusive. They'll talk about the famine, but they'll talk about famine in Africa, famine in India, and then they'll say, of course there was a terrible famine in Ireland, but famine, as we have seen, is a global issue. So that's just kind of short examples of my textbooks. So for the other observable manifestations, I give examples of national habitus that inform a population's sense of themselves, of their national identity. So I have a wide range of examples, but so for example here I have an Argentinian stamp showing Las Malvinas, and then the next one we have King George and the Falkland Islands. Of course the same territories, disputed, and both of them reinforcing to their own countries that those islands they believe belong to themselves. I also have, so now I'm going to just give you various examples of national habitus from around the world. So this is Guinness was going to launch a campaign and infiltrate the German market in the 1930s, and they commissioned their advertising campaign using popular symbols of the time. They didn't go ahead with the campaign, but wonder what Anthony Smith would make of those ethno symbols. But so there we have Captain America. I also talk about comic heroes and how they embody national ideal qualities. But what was really funny was I actually taught in a primary school last week. The teacher asked me to come in and talk about, she wanted the children to understand that our idea of the world can change and be fluid. And I was asking the kids what the pictures made them think. And I put this up, and a boy went, "Americans like war, Mummy." That was my son, sorry. But this is very interesting as well. When the British left the Republic, in a very short period of time, Ireland had to reinvent itself. So what happened a lot was, say with the post boxes, they were originally red, but they were just painted green. So here we see this stands for George Reigns. So that's King George. And these are very common around Ireland. And this was the British Army were trying to recruit Irishmen in the First World War. So there was a sinking of the Lusitania off the coast of Cork, and they used it as a tool. This is also an American recruitment poster, fighting the Russian eagle. And then this is when I talk about national hexis. So I talk about different attitudes to space. And in a lot of Asia, it's very commonplace. Sleeping is, we perceive it as a private matter to be done on our own time and space. But in Asia, sleeping is not necessarily private, so it's quite common to see people sleeping in public. Whereas, of course, here, you'd probably be arrested. So that's it, so a short and abridged version of my PhD. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm a total imposter here. I'm actually from philosophy, but I have a question for the third speaker, and it relates to the adoption of Bourdieu to explain nationalism. And one of the things I had wondered, and I thought you always compared it, is the terms Bourdieu is taking, so doxa, hexis, habitus, have a strong heritage. And I suspected at first that he was taking these from Aristotle, which they first arise. And how you have national doxa, habitus, hexis presented as very Aristotelian is in Aristotle's Politics. You have doxa as, you know, the kind of way society works, the impression society has, how it works, how it impresses on education. That habitus would be kind of the correct way of behaving to accord with that. So I won't go into that. And then hexis would be essentially, I suppose, the right state of mind. So essentially the right way to eat, the right way to go about doing this. And the problem with Aristotle's Politics is that it's very difficult to work out how does this doxa arise that affects the individual. And within the context of nationalism, I wonder how does this relationship between the individual being affected by this national doxa, how does the national doxa arise to create this element of nationalism, if that makes any sense?
So how does the individual learn their doxa?
Yeah, and then where does the doxa arise if it has to be thought?
Okay, okay. Did you have another question?
No, that's it.
Okay, I'll give you an example. I meant to give an example earlier of hexis, which is the best way I have of explaining. Actually, that question's in two parts. I'll answer the first bit about the Aristotle. There is a huge history of those terms, and Bourdieu was not the first person to invent all of this. The reason I use Bourdieu is he's so thorough, and I mean he's painstakingly thorough, and I find him. I've read all of it, and I feel like throwing it out the window because he goes on and on and on and on about the same thing. And I think, why don't you do the socialization agenda? Why don't you do the socialization of ethnicities? Just on and on about middle class thing. But that's his thing, so that's fine. But I use him because he goes on so much, and I do enjoy the fact that he goes on so much because it makes it easier to use. The second thing is, the best way that I can explain about how you absorb the hexis. When Bourdieu talks about family and at the dinner table, and you absorb, you're corrected from a very early age, you know, and you see it in class membership, you know, don't eat with your mouth full, or, you know, the woman who's struggling to feed her kids, she doesn't care whether or not her child eats because the child is eating. So it starts very early, but the best way, if you're thinking about where the hexis or the doxa comes from, there's a lot of historical reasoning behind it, and the best answer I can give you is if you think of American cutlery habits, which is, I didn't mean to put that in the presentation. If you're in America and you watch people eat, they'll pick up their fork and knife, and they do this, and they eat, and then they put the knife down. I mean, of course, not everybody. And then they pick up with the right hand, and they eat with the fork. Right now, apparently this is called the zigzag method. Somebody writes about this stuff, believe it or not. And it dates back to the late introduction of the fork to America. So us, nearly everybody here is European. Sorry, Joe, the Canadian, I've never been to Canada, I don't know how you read. But so so if you think, so when I read all of this, I was thinking, oh. And then, so of course, if you eat with a spoon and a knife, it makes sense. You put the spoon to hold your pork chop, whatever, and your knife, and then you've got to get the spoon into the other hand to eat. So there are a lot of historical reasons for the reason why these happens, but unfortunately, nobody's written thoroughly about, well, for me. Norbert Elias has written a book called The Germans, which explains a whole load of things, which goes down to sword battling and all of this, but unfortunately he only did the Germans. I'd love the Germans, the French, the Italian, the Japanese, you know. So there are a lot of reasonings behind it. I'd love to know them all, but I have only one life. So does that answer your...
Yes, I guess so. I'll have a think about it.
A lot of it's situational. You know, I would say personal space. What are the attitudes to personal space? Does it come down to population size? Does it come down to financial, you know, home building? I mean, I don't know. I'd love to know all the reasons. Do you know, why are some countries really friendly and why are others not? Is it, you know, I've mused on it. Is it the recent civil war? Is it mistrust? Is it, what is it? I don't know. So, I don't know.
Are people beginning to lag a little bit, getting tired after a long day?
I have a question for Tam, a question and a comment, and maybe some clarification. So you did your research in Belgrade and Zagreb. Do you plan to expand this, or do you think territorial? You mentioned in one of the last slides you also have different regions of Serbia. I think Serbia proper, Belgrade, and Podgorica or something, and then there are some differences. I know that, for example, in Croatia there are huge differences in voting patterns and quite constant that correlate with the socio-economic status and educational, in which northwestern Croatia, Istria tend to vote for social democratic parties, and the Slavonia and Dalmatia vote for the more conservative parties. And then these are correlated also to the education and income, general prosperity and this sort of thing. So you could also say that there is a regional dimension to class. I was wondering, do you plan to include this in your research? And also, another thing is, you talk about the degree of nationalism, and then you say how you kind of identify the degree of nationalism, and you talk about these explicit ways of exclusionary kind of things which we might call in everyday life chauvinism, but you know, I think one has to be careful because in some ways it's an appropriation of a jargon that exists in the politics of these spaces when we talk about nationalism, because nationalism can be also about progress and about equality or class equality, or even about integration. If you talk about nationalism in Egypt, for example, it's all about modernization and you know, gender equality and rights and this sort of things, rather than, you know. So there's just a comment. Yeah. Thank you.
So I can answer right away. Yeah, so actually what I'm doing right now is I'm trying to make the grid. So with in-depth interviews, I have to sample for each. So obviously, if I have age and gender and region and size of town, I'm going to have a matrix that's like, and if I have at least 10 interviews in each one, I'm going to need 1 million interviews. So age I'm going to keep constant for sure, because I'll just pick one generation, and probably also gender, because it's, otherwise there's too many boxes in the matrix. But region, I will definitely have region and size of town. And in Croatia will be Istria, Dalmatia, and then towards the border, the Herzegovinian part, and then the Zagreb area. But again, the problem is, it's really difficult with in-depth interviews. So what you have on the one hand is you have these ethnographic, really rich ethnographic studies of small studies, and then the big ones, and neither are really telling you the whole story.
Well,
so.
there is some statistical data on regions, both in Serbia and Croatia, measuring ethnic distance, for example.
Yeah.
That could be another way of putting it, rather than
Yeah, I did
talking
ethnic
about
distance for my master's dissertation, but
yeah, sure.
I'm not really happy with ethnic distance either. Because what I found, for example, in Serbia for youth, for the ethnic distance score, so how far you feel with a different, the score quantitatively was the same for, okay, so for Albanians and Roma it was the lowest, and then for Croatians very close. But when you ask them, what do you think about Croatians, what do you think about Albanians, for Croatians it was a very kind of humanistic kind of, they try to take this from us, they owe us this, it's a very reciprocal, like they see, so Serbian kids, I'm talking 10, 12, 13 years old, see Croats as their equals or their peers who are taking things away from them, who unfairly got things. Whereas for Albanians, it's kind of dirty, lazy, multiplying, very dehumanizing.
More racist.
Yeah, so it's a very, so ethnic distance, if you look at the score, it seems like you would never marry a Muslim, you would never marry an Albanian, you will never marry a Roma. But actually what's below that is a much different kind of animosity. So that's why but yeah, you're right, we have voting behavior, we have ethnic distance scores. We have support for the EU. We have the studies that you used in terms of, so there are different kinds of things you can draw upon, but the challenge is to pick the measurements that actually get closest to the operationalization of whatever we're most interested in.
Question for the first speaker. On the Eurobarometer scale that you used, you had mentioned something about new migrants and their attitude or how they identify. I didn't quite catch what you said, so if you could repeat it, I'd appreciate it.
I mean the new Europeans and old Europeans, not in terms of the membership dates of the member states. It's related with the people who moves around, who goes somewhere in Europe, new Europeans go to other countries, and old Europeans just stick into their countries. And the difference is that it's nothing related with the dates of the membership of the countries.
And, okay, all right. See, when you said New York, I had originally interpreted it as like migrants or whatnot.
No. I just skipped that part to be able to finish it in 15 minutes. Sorry for that.
No. It was an interesting paper. I would like to talk to you more about it, because there's a smaller scale example. I don't know, just when I think of European, I mean, they call it supranationalism, but I think of the EU, I don't think supranationalism is the right term for it, because
Supranationalism.
yeah, I would think it's more of, I see it more as a state type thing, and if you look at Britain as an example, and British identity versus, which to me is a state identity, and then you bring it down to the different national identities within there. This is kind of, I'm a little bit digressing here, but in terms of migrants towards, into Britain, there's been studies that show that they will identify as British, but never, well, in terms of England actually, they don't identify as English, but they identify as British because they see it as more egalitarian, so to speak, for lack of a better word. But we can talk about that later.
Yeah, I agree with you. When you put the name on nationalism, you should also add the xenophobia. But when you put the name of state, things change. It's more institutional. Thank you.
Any more questions, comments? I think everybody's tired. That was wonderful papers. I regretted not writing down notes when I had these questions, but I was taking the role of the chair. So, just finish up with the usual round of applause. Very good.